Hi there, this is John Lebensold for KillerPHP.com, and today the next video that we're going to be looking at in terms of jQuery, an introduction to jQuery, is how we can create simple events and fire them, and how we can also do a bit of animation as well. So this should be kind of interesting, and we're going to finish this off by actually building a simple menu system that you can extend for your own Ajax applications. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up from where we left off in the last video, and I have this getting jQuery file right here where we've got Google being loaded, and we've got a set on callback with a console.log, and then we've got getting jQuery right here. So I'm going to start off by saving this as a new file so that I can use the header information as well as the code that we wrote to access the Google API. So I'm just going to call this simple events.html. And I'm going to open up my browser and then going to static/simple events, which is the new file. It still says getting jQuery right here, but we're going to just change that so that this is properly labeled. And then we're going to get started. So right here, I'm just going to change this title to simple events, just so that we're all on the same page. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a paragraph. And what's interesting about this paragraph is we're actually going to mutate it. We're going to change it by using some events in jQuery. So I'm just going to create a paragraph, and I'll say, this is a paragraph of text. Inside it, I have two links. A link, oops, we'll set that later. I have a class called A-link, and I'm just going to call this A-link. And B-link. And I'm going to call this B-link. Save that, refresh it, and so now I have a very simple paragraph of text with two hyperlinks, and the hyperlinks have an anchor associated with them, this little pound that you see at the top, and that basically is it. So they're not linking to anything else, and we're going to be using these hyperlinks to fire events in our page or on our page. So we already have the Google Content Delivery Network giving us a wonderful copy of jQuery. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to actually mutate or change this paragraph of text by increasing the font size. So I'm going to do that by creating a class on my paragraph called mutate. This way I can access it easily without interfering with other classes. The next thing I want to do is I want to create a public or a global variable on my page called font size. And I'm going to set it to 1.2. That's just a decimal. There's nothing special about it quite yet. Next, I'm going to get rid of this console.log text. So now we have nothing in our callback. However, we're going to add a click event now. So I'm going to open up the $sign again, and this time I'm going to say .mutate a .click function, and I'm going to return false and console.log hyperlink clicked. So I'm just going to take a second here to explain what this code does. You'll see that we've got the $sign again, and then .mutate. And .mutate corresponds to the class we have down here. And that's why we have the prefix of a dot, because a dot is used in CSS to specify classes. So we have .mutate and then a. In other words, all of the tags that begin with a should be selected, and then I'm going to attach a .click event. And what that means is that whenever a click fires on one of those elements on my page, I want you to run this function right here. And you'll see that this function sits inside of the click bracket. So what's happening here is we've got what's called an anonymous function, a function without a name. And that function inside it has console.log, hyperlink clicked, and then return false. Now the reason we have the return false is because that way we don't get that pound sign showing up afterwards. In other words, the click event here, or the listener, is creating or is stopping any further activity on the page. So if we had, for example, a submit button, and we had a submit event listener, which we'll look at later on, and we do a return false, then we can actually stop the form from being submitted, and then we can submit the form asynchronously. Anyways, let's see what Firebug can come up with this code right here. So I'm just going to refresh this again, open up Firebug, and you'll see that when I click on A link, hyperlink clicked shows up. When I click on B link, hyperlinked clicked shows up as well. So this is already starting to work a bit. I'm going to take this example a step further by showing you how, with events, there's actually quite a bit of power. If I wanted to, I could actually figure out which hyperlink I'm dealing with within the event without being explicit. I mean, one way of doing it would be to say .mutate a.a-link, and then I would know that I'm dealing with the a-link, and then a.b-link, and then I would know that I'm dealing with the b-link. But a more intelligent way of doing this is to actually use the event that we're listening inside of the function. So for example, I could grab the inner text and I could say var text is equal to this dot text. Now what's going on here is this no longer corresponds with the page, it corresponds with the element that got clicked. And we've already used the dot text function before to grab whatever text is inside a tag. So here we're saying, give us the text of whatever this element is that's been clicked. And then here I'm just going to say text plus, and let's try that. So if I say A-link, then I get A-link, hyperlink clicked. And then if I say B-link, I get B-link, hyperlink clicked. And so if I change whatever text there is in here or in here, you'll see that it'll change down here in the console. So this is a very simple example of how to use the console to figure out what's going on and which elements are actually being clicked. Now let's get back to this mutating thing. So just like we did this and we did this text, we can actually traverse the DOM. In other words, we can travel around our document object model using jQuery. So instead I'm going to say this dot parent. In other words, if I'm in the hyperlink tag, I want to go up to its parent, which is dot mutate. And I'm just going to traverse. So I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to go up to the parent, and then I'm going to change the CSS by saying that I want the font size to be the font size plus EM. And then I want to increase the font size by 0.5. So every single time I click on this, my global variable at the top will increase by 0.5. So it'll start at 1.2, and then it'll go to 1.7, and then it'll go to 2.2, and so on and so forth. Let's see what happens. I'm going to refresh this again, and then as I click on this, you'll see that both links are increasing the font size, which is kind of cool. Let's take this a step further. If you think about it, what we're doing is we're attaching a listener to this hyperlink. But we can also attach multiple listeners to the same hyperlink at different points in our code. So I'm going to create another listener here, but this one is going to do a bit of animation. And in order to do this, I'm going to have to load another jQuery library. And this library is called jQuery UI. This is a user interface library that is an extension on the jQuery core. Normally I would have to download it and then make sure that it's all properly referenced, but thanks to Google, I just have to say google.load jQuery UI 1.5.2, that's the version, and there we go. Now down here, I just need to say .mutate .alink. In other words, grab the alink, .click. And we're just going to open that up. And here, I'm going to say this .parent .animate. And then we're going to use these squiggly braces, which I'll explain in a second, and then slow. Slow is the speed at which we're going to be doing this animation. Now, inside this curly brace is going to be another kind of notation that you're going to be seeing a lot of with jQuery, and especially JSON, which is a JavaScript data format. What this does is it basically creates a mini object inside of your JavaScript. And this mini object is like a container for variables. So we can hold multiple variables inside these two squiggly braces, and then they can get passed into the animate function. And for now, we're just going to pass in one variable, and that variable is going to have the parameter name of color and the value of red. Now, if I hit save, traditionally you would think, oh, okay, maybe the alink gets overridden and it doesn't increase in font size anymore. But actually, the alink now has two event listeners attached to it. So they're both going to fire one after another. So if I click on blink, it's just going to increase the font size like it did before. But if I click on alink, you'll see that it also increases in font size, but it also slowly animates and turns red, which is kind of neat. So we're going to take the knowledge that we've acquired here, and we're going to start a new project. And this project is going to be a very simple menu system that's going to use animation and some jQuery events. I'm going to start this off by just saving what we've got right here. And I'm going to call this menus.html. Now, we're going to need a bit of CSS to get us going. So I'm going to be writing a bit of that, and I'm also going to have to change our current HTML. By the way, as you see this start to grow, it would make sense to create your own JavaScript file that sits in another file, and then just to simply reference it. The same way that we reference ajax.googleapis.com/JSAPI, you can reference local or remote .javascript files, .js files, and they'll run on your page. So you could take, this body of code right here, stick it in a function, and then you could call that function from your page. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this title is actually going to be called Simple Events Menus. And down here, we're going to create a unordered list, and we're going to have some list items because this is a menu after all, and then a hyperlink. We're going to call this nav A, and I'm going to copy this a couple times. We'll have nav A, nav B, nav C, and nav D. And then down here I'm going to have another div of type or of class content. And inside that I'm going to have a paragraph with a bit of text in my content section. And lastly, I'm going to create a container around my whole div structure. And a div is just a division in your page. So this is a div that is wrapped around our whole project. If I hit save, refresh this, we've changed our file name, so I should change that to menus.html. So far it's not very interesting. With a bit of CSS though, it's going to look a lot better. So let's get started with the CSS, the styling of our document object model, or our HTML page. So I'm going to start with a style tag of type text/ CSS. And again, you probably want to put this in another file, a .css file. But for the purposes of this example, I think it's simpler just to keep it all in one page. It'll make it a lot easier to read instead of jumping back and forth. So the first thing I want to style is the actual body. And the body should have a background of gray, EF, EF, EF. The EF corresponds to red, and then this EF corresponds to red, green, and then the last two EFs correspond to blue. And then we're going to say that the font family should be Arial and sans serif. We're just specifying a primary font and a font in case that primary font doesn't exist. And we're going to have our container, which will be center aligned. This top margin is 0 and the left and right margin are set to auto. And we're going to give it a width of 850 pixels, a background of white, and we'll just have a nice little border around our container so we can create a bit of definition, also of gray. You'll notice that I'm indenting my CSS here. This is a trick that a associate of mine taught me, which I thought was really neat because it lets you kind of see the structure of your page within your CSS as well. So we've got a title tag, which is being styled as well. And you'll notice that I've got a dot container, which corresponds to the class container, and a pound title, which corresponds to the ID title. And this is just typical CSS. And this is how CSS selects various elements on a page. Also, before we get into styling the navigation, I want to add some more classes here. I'm going to have an unordered list, but this unordered list is special. It's going to be of type nav. And we're going to start by saying that our nav item B is going to have the class called active. And this is going to be really helpful in helping us style which is the active navigation on our page. So I'm going to refresh this again. It should look a little different now. So we've got our title at the top and our navigation and then a bit of text in my content section. Now we just need to style the navigation. So we're going to start off by saying that our nav doesn't have those ugly bullets. It's going to have a background of dark gray, the same dark gray that we have in the title. It's going to be centered, and it's going to have a height of 40 pixels. Then for each list item inside of our navigation, we want that to be displayed in line. We want it to float left. In other words, we want them to be stacked one next to the other. If our nav container is 40 pixels, we want our height of our nav items to be 34 pixels with a padding of 0 pixels and 10 pixels. So this is the top padding and bottom padding, and this is the left padding and the right padding. We'll just set some margins all across. So if you think of a clock, you've got 5 pixels on the top, 5 pixels on the right, no pixels on the bottom, and 5 pixels on the left, so that we've got some space around our nav items. And we've got a line height of 10 pixels. What this will do is move the text inside of our list items down a notch. We're going to be using this for animation later. We also need to specify a bit of a background so that there's some definition. And let's create a border. So the border width is going to be 1 pixel on the top, 1 pixel on the right, no pixels on the bottom, and 1 pixel on the left, so that it creates like a tab. The border style has to be something, so we'll say it's solid, just a solid line, and a color of 999, which is another gray, a little lighter than 666. Refresh this, and we've got ourselves some tabs. They're not too shabby, but they could use a bit of work. So now that I've got my list item, I'm trying to go through this relatively quickly just because this is a jQuery tutorial and not a CSS tutorial. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me or talk about them in the Killer PHP forum. So we want our hyperlinks to have a certain color, and we'll say that the text decoration should be none. In other words, we don't want that underline. And now we're going to start styling our active div items. And this is very important. So we've got an active element here, and we want our active elements to look a little different from the rest of our elements. Actually, before I get into this, I want to make sure that I can get the content to appear underneath. So we've got this content container, but we haven't done any styling with it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say content clear both. And what this does is it basically tells the browser that we don't want our float elements to interfere with our content. We want our content to appear underneath. So if I refresh this, my content should appear underneath now. So it looks like my background color here isn't showing up. Let's just go back. Oh, I've got a typo here. I forgot my colon after height. Refresh this again. Okay, so now it looks like a regular navigation system, except that it doesn't look like any of the navigational items are actually selected right now. So let's fix that. I'm going to start off by saying that my .nav list item of type active should have a background of white. Perfect. Next, I want to change the height of it to 35 pixels. And if you think about this, the reasoning behind it is that we want to create that little indent here to show that it is an active element. I don't know if you saw that, but if I just get rid of that, you'll see if you go very closely in here, if I refresh this again, they all have the same width. But if I have that height of 35 pixels, then there's that slight indentation. I know it's a detail, but it's kind of nice. Also, I want to make the text a little more obvious. So I'm going to say .nav li.active and a. In other words, only take the hyperlink that is selected under the class name .active in the navigation of class type .nav or of nav. And again, we'll just say that we want our text decoration to be none. And we'll just specify a nice red. And 5.4, 5b, I'm not really sure. Refresh this. Oh, I keep missing those colons. Okay, there we go. So we've got ourselves a nice red over there. Looks good. So, with our very simple navigation in place, we're going to start attaching some events. Because right now, if I click on it, you can see that the pound sign is showing up at the top, which is very nice. And also, it's not actually doing anything. So to start off, let's go back here to our top, and we're going to create some new events. We don't need our mutate stuff that we did in the last tutorial, but we're going to be creating some click events. So it's actually quite simple. All we need to do is select anything inside the .nav that's a list item and that's a hyperlink inside of a list item inside of a class of type .nav. So that's basically all of the list items. Click, and then we're going to create an anonymous function. Close that up. And then inside here, we want to, first off, clear any class of type active. So I'm going to say .nav li .remove class active. Now that there aren't any active classes, I want to add one to this, which is the hyperlink parent. Go up to the list item .add class active. Lastly, I just want to return false. If we hit save again, refresh this page, and if I click on here, if I click on here, or if I click on here, you can see that our active navigation is now being set, which is kind of neat. And we could extend this example by having a bunch of hidden divs and then putting our content in those hidden divs. And we could have like a content A and a content B and a content C, and then we could just show different content on the page with a bit of Ajax. Lastly, I want to show you a bit of animation. So I'm going to open up the $ again, except this time it'll be .nav li. So in other words, just a list item, not the hyperlink. And we're going to say hover function. We're going to open this up, comma, function. I'll explain this in a minute. Open that up, and then we're just going to close our hover function. So our hover function takes two arguments, both of which are functions. And these functions are for the on state and off state. In other words, when we mouse over it and when we mouse off of whatever we are hovering on. So in this case, we hover onto the list item. When we hover on, whatever we put in to this part will fire, and then when we hover off, whatever we put on this part will fire. I'll just show you what that means in a second with the console.log. Hover on, and we can make this a little more apparent with a bit of handy logging. Hit save, refresh this, open Firebug, and you can see that it's hovering on and off. So that's working. I'm just going to comment these lines out, and we're going to do a bit of animation instead. So I'm going to say this.animate. Again, we're going to use our curly braces. And this time we're going to animate, instead of by saying fast or slow, we're going to specify the number of milliseconds. So 150 is pretty fast. And then I'm going to say that the line height should be 25 pixels when I hover over it. And when I'm done, it should go back to 10 pixels, which, if you remember, is what we specified over here, our line height. If I refresh this again, you'll see that we're getting a bit of animation. In the next video, we're going to be looking at how we can actually manipulate the document object model. In other words, how we can manipulate the HTML on our page. Thanks for listening.